Quebec passed a law on Thursday giving it the power to set minimum French language content thresholds on streaming giants like Spotify and Netflix. The government says the law is meant to protect Quebec's culture by making French content easier to access. The streaming platforms, though, are already reacting negatively to the law, and some lawyers believe it could be unconstitutional. Joining me now is Alan Mendelson, a lawyer specializing in internet law. Welcome to the show.
Good evening, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Alan, can you just explain, first of all, I did a brief summary, but how does this law work exactly?
So first of all, the Bill 109 that was passed does two things. First of all, it enshrines something in the Quebec Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It enshrines the right to discoverability of French content. So that's one thing it does. And then it creates an entirely new act that has a lot of obligations on streaming providers, both video streaming providers and audio streaming providers, in terms of how much French content they need to present to Quebecers.
So is it basically they would set a proportion, so 20 or 25% of the content available on these platforms would have to be French? Is that that's my understanding.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yeah, that is absolutely correct. That is one of the main purposes of the act that's created under Bill 109. It will require a certain proportion of, besides the sort of discoverability requirements, it wants to make the streamers make French content easier to find. But much more importantly, in terms of a ratio, it's going to provide for a certain forcing your Netflixes and your Spotifys and so forth to provide a certain proportion of French content. What that proportion is, we do not know as of now.
So both Spotify and Netflix are both expressing concern. They actually argue that the law will make it harder for Quebecers to access content. How do you think that is? Like, what's their argument on this?
Well, I'm not sure that that's really the case, to be honest with you. I would tend to disagree with that. I mean, right now, it's not difficult to find French content on Netflix or Spotify. You just search. First of all, you can switch your language default to French. Second of all, you can just search for whatever you want in the French language and it will come up. The issue is that, is there enough content on those platforms in French? And is French being sort of pushed forward to Quebec users? And the answer is probably no. But the fact is, even if you watch one thing in French on Netflix now, the Netflix algorithm on its own already will say, well, you've watched one thing in French, you're going to want to watch more things in French. So here's several suggestions for you that are going to be in French.
Is this constitutional? Can the government of Quebec do this?
Well, that's going to be a big question. And I expect at some point, Netflix and Spotify might take this to court. The fact is that telecommunications and broadcasting, both of which the internet can be considered part of, have always been matters for the federal government to regulate. Provincial governments and federal governments have different spheres under the original Constitution from 1867 as to what they can, legislate in. And it's been held by courts over and over and over, going back to radio cases from the early 20th century, that telecommunications, broadcasting, those are federal matters. So this would seem to fall in that same category, regulating the internet, which is a federal matter, although the Quebec government will argue that we're regulating culture, which can be a provincial matter. So that debate will have to be settled by a court.
So what would the argument from the province be? Because they are saying that this is a matter of protecting the culture. They say as these streaming giants grow, the culture seems to recede. The evidence that they point to is that of the 10,000 most streamed songs in Quebec last year, only 8.5% were French language songs. So does the government not have a responsibility or the right to protect its culture?
Well, certainly it has a right to protect its culture. There's no question about that. That is firmly established both constitutionally and legally and historically and everything. And protecting the culture, you have to figure out what you're going to do to protect the culture. Is forcing international companies to force feed Quebecers a certain amount of French content, is that the appropriate way to protect culture? There are other ways to protect culture. You can invest in the cultural communities, making sure that there is enough audiovisual content out there for people to consume and that they want to consume, and promoting Quebec culture as opposed to forcing, culture onto Quebecers in this manner.
All right. Alan Mendelson, lawyer specializing in internet law. Thanks very much for this. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Matt. Thanks for having me.